state. We're going to alternate, as a number of people who wanted to participate in this program couldn't do so in person, between videos of them that they've kindly permitted to be made for this meeting, and of course a panel of experts who I'm very pleased are able to be with us in person. I'll say a few words about each. We will, as I say, alternate between the videos and the in-person presentations. We will be happy to take questions from you at the end, and I understand we have some people who are participating by conference call, and Emily from Shirley and Bannister is going to be the intermediary here somehow to manage to get the questions from them. Hopefully they're hearing adequately the remarks that I'm making and those that will be made by my colleagues. Thank you, Emily, for your help, and thank you again to all of you for participating. Our first speaker is Dr. Peter Vincent Pry. When there comes to matters of national security writ large, and most especially to this particular piece of the national security challenges that face our country, there are few in the nation who I think exhibit greater understanding and certainly bring greater depth of experience to the topic than Peter Pry. Peter served in a number of capacities in the United States government, including as an analyst in the Central Intelligence Agency. He has been a professional staff member on the House Armed Services Committee. He served as one of the staff members on the EMP Threat Commission that was chartered by Congress. A very important, Emily, if you could just hand me one of the books there, please. The commission published two terrific reports, both of which are, by the way, summarized in this product. This is a short compendium of 11 different studies that the Center for Security Policy produced a short while ago, entitled Guilty Knowledge: What the U.S. government knows about the vulnerability of the electric grid but refuses to fix. As I say, Peter served on the EMP Threat Commission, which is summarized in two places in this compendium, and we're delighted to have him with us to talk about his current work as the Executive Director of the National and Homeland Security Task Force, and specifically on what this attack last April represented, what it might have meant, and also what was going on at about the same time, which adds even greater urgency to the focused attention we're trying to bring to the matter of grid vulnerability. Dr. Pry, welcome.
Thank you, Frank. It's appropriate. The anniversary, April 16th, may be remembered not just as the anniversary of the Metcalf attack, which was the most significant attack on the U.S. electric grid in our history, but also, if it is true, if reports are true that the Russian tanks are rolling into eastern Ukraine on this day, this may be another historic reason to remember this anniversary that would also be related to threats to critical infrastructures, especially the electric grids, since a key part of Russian military doctrine is EMP attacks, cyber attacks, kinetic attacks like that happened on Metcalf on the electric grid and critical infrastructures as a means of defeating adversaries. And they have used these kinds of tactics before. First, let me just briefly talk about the kinds of threats the Secure Grid organization is concerned with. We're concerned with all of those threats that relate to the grid, most of them captured by what our potential adversaries refer to as a all-out cyber warfare operation. The Russian, the Chinese, the Iranians, and the North Koreans all basically have the same military doctrine for cyber warfare operation, which, unlike ours, goes beyond computer viruses and hacking. That's one serious threat to the grid. Computer viruses and hacking, bugs that you can insert into SCADA systems that would disrupt the grid. They go beyond that to include kinetic attacks, like what happened at Metcalf, where you could use snipers, sabotage operations, rocket-propelled grenade launchers. In this case, if you're dealing with a country like Iran or North Korea, they're ally. You might have to be concerned about terror cells within the country that could execute these kinds of attacks on a much larger scale. And I would point out that John Wellinghoff and others who talked about the Metcalf incident regarded it not as a failed attack, but as a dry run for a much larger threat to our grid, a future threat to our grid. In a dry run or an exercise, you're not trying to inflict maximum damage. The point is you're trying to see how far you can push the envelope in terms of executing your operations without alarming the enemy to the point where he takes steps to protect the grid subsequently from these kinds of measures. So if he's right about that, we have to be concerned that Metcalf may be an ominous harbinger for much more ambitious, wider attacks on the grid that could come later. So we've talked about the cyber threats, talked about kinetic attacks. EMP is another part of the cyber warfare operation in Russian, Chinese, North Korean, Iranian military doctrine. So it spans all of this spectrum of threats. An electromagnetic pulse can be generated by non-nuclear weapons, radio frequency weapons that have more limited range. Some of them are for sale on the open market. Some of them could be built from design information available on the internet and built from Radio Shack parts. When I was on the House Armed Services Committee, we did an experiment where we had two such devices, non-nuclear radio frequency weapons built using Radio Shack parts with a very small budget and a team of experts who did this. Nuclear EMP weapons are the biggest threat to the grid. And we have seen Iran in open source military writings talk about taking the United States out as an actor on a world stage by means of nuclear EMP attack. And perhaps not coincidentally, North Korea has also demonstrated an interest and capability to do this by the launch of its KSM-3 satellite back in December 2012, which was a classic trajectory for what's called a fractional orbital bombardment system, a secret weapon invented by the Soviet Union during the Cold War that would orbit a nuclear weapon like a satellite on a southern trajectory so it could approach the United States from the south and take us by surprise, hitting us from our blind side, because we have no ballistic missile early warning radars and no missile interceptors facing south. Is it a coincidence that on April 16th, a year ago, April 16th, while the Metcalf transformer substation was being attacked, the KSM-3 satellite was off over the Washington, D.C., New York corridor at exactly that same time, which would be the ideal location for taking down the eastern grid. That's where the biggest concentration of EHV transformers is in the whole United States. And it also would have put the peak EMP field over Washington and New York City, which is, of course, the political center and the economic business center of the United States. The odds are literally thousands to one against that being a coincidence, but perhaps it is. Stranger things have happened. I personally don't think so. If you toed up all of the things that were happening during the nuclear crisis with North Korea that began with their nuclear weapons test on February 12th and lasted through the end of April. And don't forget that President Obama was taking so seriously North Korean threats to strike the United States with a nuclear missile that we were conducting B-2 bomber demonstrations, dropping gravity bombs outside the demilitarized zone. And also he strengthened the national missile defenses at this particular time, although not to the south. They were not strengthened to the south, and we were still wide open and vulnerable from that direction. But all of the elements of how the North Koreans and the Russians, the Iranians, Chinese would define a all-out cyber warfare operation were present during that time, because the grid is constantly under attack from cyber bugs and viruses. These two, most of them, are dry runs. They're not intended to take down the grid. They're intended to probe our defenses, go to the limits of what's possible, to explore just how vulnerable we are and what they might be able to get away with in a future offensive operation if they have to implement it. Of course, we had the Metcalf attack, which was looked at not just by the U.S. Navy SEALs, but by the people who trained the U.S. Navy SEALs. So the best of the best looked at that and came to the conclusion that this was a professional operation, the kind of thing the SEALs would have executed and the way they would have executed it. We had the KSM-3 satellite overhead. Actually, it was overhead a couple of times during the nuclear crisis. On the 8th of April, a week before Metcalf, it was pretty much over the center of the country, where an EMP field could have been put down over all 48 contiguous United States. And then on April 16th, simultaneously with Metcalf, is when it appeared on the Washington-New York City corridor. Another dimension of the EMP threat, not part of a cyber warfare operation, but something we're concerned with, those of us concerned with grid security, are the natural threats to the grid. You know, a catastrophic natural threat would be geomagnetic storms, like the recurrence of the Carrington-class event, or even the 1989 Hydro-Quebec storm, which is much more common, 100 times less powerful than Carrington. But if that were to recur over at a lower latitude over the Washington, D.C., New York area, it would put 20 to 40 million Americans into blackout. A run-of-the-mill storm like that, so you don't have to be concerned just about a civilization-ending Carrington. And not only we, but the National Intelligence Council is concerned about recurrence of Carrington. In their unclassified report available on the internet, Global Trends 2030, the National Intelligence Council warns that a recurrence of a Carrington-class geomagnetic superstorm is one of just 8 black swan events that could, by or before the year 2030, change the course of global civilization, because it would collapse electric grids not just in the United States but worldwide. And were we to protect our grid against these threats that I'm talking about, especially the nuclear EMP threat, which is the most worrisome of all, it would protect us against all of these other threats. So in effect, it's an all-hazard strategy, because all of these threats basically attack a certain number of common nodes, SCADA systems, EHV transformers, command posts that run the grid. And if you're hardened against EMP, it will greatly mitigate all the other effects, whether they're cyber or physical attacks or natural disasters, not just geomagnetic storms, but even the overvoltages that damage the grid that can result from hurricanes or tornadoes. It would also significantly produce grid resiliency against these more commonplace and day-to-day threats.
This is a very important moment, I think, in our nation's history, and there are a few people who both understand our nation's history better, who have written more about it, who have helped, in fact, make a fair amount of it, than our first video presenter. The former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, is one of the 2 co-chairmen of our coalition, the other being R. James Woolsey, the former Director of Central Intelligence under President Clinton. Speaker Gingrich could not be with us in person again, but is a champion. Those of you who will recall his ill-fated effort during the last presidential election may well remember one of his most powerful statements in the course of the campaign was about the concern that he had about the vulnerability of our grid, specifically to electromagnetic pulse. And I'm very pleased that he was able to give us a few words here by videotape. If we're ready to go, let us play Speaker Gingrich's remarks.
I want to thank Frank Gaffney for his continued leadership in what is, frankly, one of the problems that most worries me. If we have a significant assault on our electrical production and distribution system, we face a crisis as our civilization. People don't realize it, but you start losing electricity for 2, 3, 4, 5 days. Everything around you starts to fall apart. Various medicines that have to be refrigerated, the food supply, the ability to go to work. Just go down the list. And there's a real danger that we could have an attack or a natural incident that would dramatically impact our electric production capability and our electric distribution capability. Some of you will remember back, I think it was in 1965, when the entire Northeast had several days without power because of a particular problem in Quebec, which then just simply had a multiplier effect all the way down the system. That was a sobering wake-up call, and yet even today, when people 50 years later should realize this is a real deal, this could be a disaster, it's very hard to get people's attention to focus on this. The Department of Homeland Security doesn't have the resources, doesn't know exactly how to approach it. The White House, and this is true whether Democrat or Republican, has too many other things to worry about. The military, which works very hard at hardening military facilities, has refused to recognize that if the entire civilian economy goes down, then we're going to be in an enormous problem as a country. So I'm delighted that we are once again have smart people coming together to talk about the need for developing a safe, secure, hardened electrical system. And let me point out, the threats range from something as simple as a kinetic attack at strategic places by a relatively small number of people, to an electromagnetic pulse attack that might well take out half the country in terms of its electric generating and distributing capacity, to the very real threat that sooner or later we're going to see a solar flare on a grand scale. We all know technically that back in 1859 we saw a flare of that size, that it had a huge impact, and that was back when, frankly, electricity didn't matter very much and when it wasn't that big a crippling effect. But that same size solar event today would wreak havoc and cause probably several $1 trillion of damage worldwide. So this is a very important topic. I believe it may be the most important topic in national security, because an electromagnetic pulse event or a very, very large solar event are the only things I can think of that could literally cripple the society so decisively, barring a spasm nuclear war with hundreds of warheads. But that's very unlikely. No country that I know of that has that scale of nuclear weapon is likely to use it in that kind of an effect. But the danger of an electromagnetic pulse effect is very different. And if we remain unprotected, it allows countries like North Korea, who could not match us in nuclear weapons, but might be able to cripple us with an electromagnetic pulse weapon. It allows them to think that there's a zone of vulnerability they or the Iranians or others might exploit. I commend you for getting together. This is a very important topic. It could literally be a matter of life and death for America. And what you're doing deserves to have national attention.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's sobering words, needless to say. I'd like to go to Congressman Franks next. Trent Franks, of course, has been one of those who has been sounding this warning very assiduously in the United States Congress, where he currently serves, representing the people of the 8th Congressional District of Arizona. He is a member of the House Armed Services Committee, serves on its Strategic Forces Subcommittee, among other committee assignments. He is also the co-chairman of the EMP caucus in the United States House of Representatives, with Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, a Democrat of New York, as his counterpart. This is a very important caucus focused on this effort and has been instrumental in presenting some the legislative ideas that Congressman Franks will speak about in the video now.
Hello, I'm Congressman Trent Franks from the 8th District of Arizona. And I just want to thank the Center for Security Policy for being a recognized leader in articulating the dangers our nation faces from electromagnetic pulse and geomagnetic disturbance. More than 10 federal government studies have explicitly stated the vulnerabilities to our grid coming from these two possibilities. The effects of geomagnetic storms and electromagnetic pulses on our electric infrastructure are very well documented, with nearly every space weather and EMP expert recognizing the dramatic disruptions and cataclysmic collapses these pulses can bring to electric grids. Our national security and the reliability of our electric grid are intrinsically related. Without the grid, telecommunications no longer operate. Transportation of every kind is profoundly affected. Sewage and water treatment facilities stop, and a safe and continuous food supply is interrupted. It's also important to remember that the Department of Defense depends upon the commercial electric grid within the continental United States for 99% of its electricity needs, without which it cannot effect its mission. Today, we mark the one-year anniversary of what credible official voices have deemed a potential terrorist attack on our electric grid in San Jose, California. It is encouraging that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is taking action to direct the electric utility sector to develop reliability standards for the physical security of the U.S. electric grid. Yet the call for these particular standards occurred only after AK-47s were used to shoot up several significant transformers. Much larger vulnerabilities and threats exist which must be addressed by FERC as well as Congress. The U.S. electric grid is called the largest machine ever built because of its interoperability, the ability to deliver power from one area of the country to another. This interoperability is one of the reasons our entire nation has become so vulnerable to nuclear and non-nuclear electromagnetic pulse. We have, as I've said many times, become victims of our own technological advance. Now, I'm so very grateful to the Center for Security Policy and for what you're all doing to inform the nation of this critical national security vulnerability. Thank you for holding this forum and for your recent publication of Frank Gaffney's compilation and summary of scientific reports and research called Guilty Knowledge. What a name. We are having greater momentum every day with newspaper and television reports, and we must maintain that momentum if at all possible. As many of you know, my primary contribution to protecting the country against the EMP threat is through national legislation. I have introduced H.R. 2417, the SHIELD Act. The SHIELD Act is both an accountability solution, improving cooperation between our federal and commercial energy experts, and it is a practical solution. It ensures that hardware-based solutions are used to protect the grid. I believe this bill to be a vitally important component to protecting this nation against the threat of electromagnetic pulse. As hard as it is to plan for the unthinkable, the U.S. must also have a robust pre-disaster planning with exercises that include top officials who rehearse a wide variety of contingency scenarios. Consequently, I've also introduced H.R. 3410, the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act. It enhances the Department of Homeland Security's threat assessments for geomagnetic disturbance and electromagnetic pulse blackouts. I believe this bill has a good chance to be signed into law and serve as a major milestone in advancing actual preventative solutions to this critical challenge. It is important for all of us to remember that a worst-case EMP or GMD event could have cataclysmic impact upon all and everything that we love. Ultimately, the greatest threat in dealing with the EMP threat, or threat of any consequence for that matter, is our own inaction. Consequently, our charge is to get out there and inform as many Americans as possible about this grave national security challenge. Because there is that moment in the life of every problem when it is big enough to be seen and still small enough to be addressed. And you and I have both the privilege and the responsibility of living in that moment when there is still time to prevent and protect against this dangerous threat. Finally, I would just ask for whatever support you might give for our legislative efforts in Congress. And I just want to thank all of you at the Center for Security Policy for your efforts on this issue and so many others that are vital to America's national security. You all will never be accused of inaction. God keep every one of you.
Congressman Franks, thank you very much. I would like to go next to Tom Popik. Tom is a member of our coalition. He is the chairman of the Foundation for Resilient Societies, and one of the country's preeminent authorities on what has been basically the impediment to getting this threat addressed. You've heard compelling arguments for doing so. I think, again, the Metcalf episode made it clear these are not hypotheticals. This is a real world drill, a real world threat. And Tom Popik has been working to monitor what is being done by the utilities and the regulators, both at the federal and state level, and I think has some important insights into how this problem, this vulnerability of our grid persists. His comments, as you'll hear, are going to reflect in part some insights that came out of a hearing that was held just last week by the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Its title was Keeping the Lights On. Are we doing enough to protect the reliability and security of the electric grid. As you'll hear from Tom, the hearing left a lot to be desired, as does the fact that we've not gotten more help from those who you would think have the most direct vested interest in protecting the grid's assets and infrastructure. Let's go to Tom.
Hello, my name is Tom Popik. I'm chairman of the Foundation for Resilient Societies, a nonprofit group with the mission of protecting critical infrastructure, including the United States electric grid. Today, I'd like to tell you about three things. First, how electric grid reliability in the United States is regulated. Second, about an attack that occurred just outside San Jose, California, on a critical grid substation about a year ago in April. And third, a current situation in regard to improving regulations for electric grid reliability. First, how is electric grid reliability regulated in the United States? Well, not very well at all. It would come as a surprise to most Americans to learn that the federal government does not directly regulate electric grid reliability. Instead, this responsibility has been delegated to a private corporation, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. This corporation is governed by the vote of its members, and 70% of its members are electric utilities. Now I'd like to tell you about an attack that occurred about a year ago. 17 extra high voltage transformers were shot out at the Metcalf Grid Substation just outside San Jose. Had this attack been successful, and had the damage to the transformers not been detected as soon as it was, there could have been a cascading blackout through Silicon Valley and also for the city of San Francisco. Moreover, because these transformers can take months or years to replace, that entire area could have been without electricity for a long period of time. What's happening right now? Well, not much happened for a year until on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, it was revealed that just a few critical grid substations, when damaged, could take down much of the United States electric grid. At this news, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission ordered NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, to develop a standard for physical protection of grid substations and control centers. Never mind that just a few weeks after the Metcalf attack, this same private corporation had canceled a physical security standard which they had in progress. But the draft standard published by NERC only includes grid substations and some, but not all, control centers. In fact, the control centers for 140 million Americans would be left out. I urge you to learn more about how electric grid reliability is regulated and to become involved in this important cause. Thank you for attending today's conference.
Tom Popik, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to have with us a colleague and duty expert in his own right on these issues of grid resiliency and reliability. In fact, Michael Del Rosso served as the chairman of the International Electric and Electronics Engineers
Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers.
I get this wrong every time. IEEE is the way I remember it best. Critical Infrastructure Protection Committee, and had some very important insights from his experience in that committee and its deliberations in the attitude that has caused the utilities to take the kind of attitude that Tom Popik has just described. Michael Del Rosso is a senior fellow with the Center for Security Policy, I'm pleased to say, and also with the Claremont Institute. We're delighted to have you with us, Michael, to talk a bit about both what you have ascertained in terms of this problem with our understanding, at least at the level of the electric utilities, the need to correct this problem, and your insights into what can be done specifically to take corrective action. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Is this on now?
It's on now.
Okay. So when faced with a serious problem that might be existential in this case, a nation like America assembles the best minds to go look at it. Well, In the last decade, we've done that at least 5 times, as have other bodies like the British Ministry of Defense, where we got the best minds in the country together. And the EMP Commission that Congress convened, that Peter was managed, with the National Academy of Sciences study on space weather, Oak Ridge National Laboratory studies. And all of these studies are in concurrence that this is an existential threat. These vulnerabilities are real. The threats and the hazards are real. However, this information has not been very well disseminated. So, as Frank was alluding, when I was chairman of the Institute for Electrical and Electronic Engineers Critical Infrastructure Protection Committee, most of the members of that committee were PhDs in electrical engineering. They had 30 or more years in the power industry, but they were not aware that of the magnitude of the problems and the effects of the problems, because prior to, say, 2008, these were fairly classified pieces of information. The United States has known about it for 50 years. For 50 years, they've protected the most important strategic military systems that they have. And as a side note, when people say that the military might have protection, it's only in the strategic, offensive, and communications and control necessary to retaliate against a nuclear attack. It is not the military per se. The bulk of the military, you can expect them to contribute to the casualty list. You effectively would not have a national defense other than some strategic systems. And so I actually got one of the leading experts in this field, Dr. Bill Radasky, the holder of the Lord Kelvin Medal of Physics and an Air Force Academy grad and PhD at UC Santa Barbara, who has been looking at this phenomenon for 40 years in the military, for the Air Force, and private industry. And when he came out and briefed us in Washington, D.C. about 8 years ago, and basically humbled everyone to understand, unless you tested this, you don't know that what the effects will be, and the effects are devastating. So right now you have scenarios where there's still a dearth of information. I know of a major utility that had to go to their state police agencies to get them to help them do the kind of security that might be needed to prevent against the Metcalf attack. They posted 24/7 state police officers with weapons on a dozen and a half of the most critical substations. They were doing ongoing site assessments, and they did not even have a connection into the Department of Homeland Security of whatever expertise they might have. So basically you have DHS statutorily responsible for a decade with critical infrastructure protection, but doing a very poor job of rank prioritizing. And it does get down to numbers. So for instance, we're worried about another Carrington event. Well, we got the best scientific minds together in the National Academy of Sciences study. They think that right now, a Carrington event, the last major one happened in 1859, 155 years ago. They think it's a 150 to a 300-year event based on thousands of years of ancient script documents describing auroral phenomena that we know are attributed to a large geomagnetic disturbance. What that translates to in layman's terms is every decade there's a 16% probability of having a Carrington event that could bring down massive parts of the grid in the United States and other nations of the world for years. That's 16%. That's the same odds as Russian roulette. No sane person would put a revolver to their head and take a 16% chance that they'd put a bullet through their brain. Yet every decade, we're 5 years into the first decade of this window, that we're taking such an odd. And it's pennies. They estimate around $500 million is all that's necessary to prevent the 3,000 or so large transformers from a geomagnetic disturbance using neutral shunts. That money is not being spent. The implications of our study is that you'd have trillions of dollars of economic damage and millions of lives at risk, yet they're not willing to spend a 1/100% of what the repercussions are to protect against it. And it's a matter of the public getting our congressional leaders to enact those two pieces of legislation Representative Franks introduced, and to force the people that draw paychecks ostensibly to protect the critical infrastructure to step up and do something about it.
Michael, thank you very much. Our last video is from another leader in the Congress on these issues, in fact, the co-sponsor with Congressman Franks of the legislation that the Congressman mentioned second, the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act. This legislator happens to have among his other credits the fact that he is the chairman of the House Rules Committee, which means that he packs a lot of gear in the United States House. He is, of course, Congressman Pete Sessions. He represents the people of the 32nd District of Texas and has been a champion of this legislation and I think of the national security for many years. We're delighted to have him joining us by a brief video as well.
Hello, I'm Congressman Pete Sessions from Dallas, Texas. And I'm sorry that I cannot be with you all today as we mark the first anniversary of the Metcalf Substation attack. But I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share a few words and thoughts with you today. I want to begin by saying thank you to Frank Gaffney, the founder and the president of the Center for Security Policy, and Dr. Peter Pry, the executive director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security. Both Frank and Peter have provided the leadership and policy expertise needed to educate and spread awareness regarding the new types of potential threats and occurrences such as an electromagnetic pulse that could dramatically disrupt electronic activity or severely damage our electrical grids. Our lead in Congress on this issue is my dear friend Congressman Trent Franks from Arizona. Congressman Franks and I serve as the chair and vice chair of the Missile Defense Caucus, and this past year we introduced H.R. 3410, the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act in Congress. Our bill directs the Department of Homeland Security to enhance our nation's threat assessments of EMPs and to plan how best protect and recover America after EMP events occur. The Critical Infrastructure Protection Act is the first step towards getting the United States closer to protecting ourselves from a potentially catastrophic nationwide blackout. Additionally, it is my hope that this bill will promote a national dialogue about the threat EMPs pose to our nation in an effort to educate as many people as possible and to ensure that we are adequately prepared to protect our nation's critical infrastructure. Thank you all for being here today to discuss this important issue and for giving me the opportunity to say hello. I hope you enjoy the rest of today's event, and God bless you, and God bless America.
Again, thank you very much, Congressman Sessions. Finally, we're going to hear from a man, you've just been treated to a little bit of a presentation about the impact of the EMP threat on the United States military, the appreciation the military has had of that threat, at least with respect to the need to harden their strategic forces capabilities. We're looking at the danger that if the civilian society is not similarly protected, or for that matter, as Michael says, the rest of the military is not protected, it can be indeed an existential problem. I'm very pleased that we have with us Major General Robert Newman, United States Air Force retired. He has been working with us in the coalition to bring to bear his expertise not only as a senior and distinguished combat veteran of the United States Air Force, but also as a former adjutant general in the Commonwealth of Virginia from 2006 to 2010. The combination of these experiences, I think, has really enriched our coalition's attention to a fundamental reality here. And while Congressman Franks talked about the importance in the bill that he's sponsoring with Congressman Sessions clearly addresses this idea of trying to contend with the reality of this kind of almost apocalyptic event after it happens. General Newman has given some considerable thought to what you do to prevent that from happening, for the simple reason that it is very problematic to try to unscramble the eggs, a responsibility that would be falling disproportionately on the National Guard, which you, of course, commanded in Virginia. Thank you very much for joining us, General. It's a delight to have you with us, sir.
Thank you, Frank. Always good to be with you and my fellow panelists here. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I will not attempt to talk about the importance of securing the grid. Our friends and colleagues have done a fantastic job of establishing the vulnerabilities and the necessity that we face as Americans to protect the grid. What I wanted to talk a little bit about today is our military's response and the response of first responders should a catastrophic event befall the power structure throughout our country. Now, I've had experience in responding to a number of disasters wearing the uniform. I was a 3 Victor at Joint Forces Command during Katrina. Now, translating that in civilian terms, that means we handled the operational flow of forces, both Guard, Reserve, as well as active duty, into the Katrina operational area. Also, as Adjutant General, we've responded to a number of different emergencies, whether they were hurricanes in coastal Virginia, or whether they were forest fires in the southwestern part of the Commonwealth. My experience spans a great deal of different emergencies, but one thing comes out that is a common thread throughout all of these responses is that the military relies heavily on our civilian infrastructure to provide those responses. Whether it's transportation across highways, whether it's a communication system, whether it's power to refuel our vehicles to get logistics downrange, we, the military in the United States, here in the continental United States, rely on the infrastructure which, as has been properly noted today, is extremely vulnerable to a catastrophic event that could take it down. Whether it's a physical attack or whether it's an electronic magnetic pulse by whatever means, our grid upon which our responders rely is extremely vulnerable. You know, we only have to look at what happened in Atlanta this past winter. Remember when 2 days of snow of about 4 inches down there totally locked up the Atlanta area. And that's with infrastructure still operating and the government still intact. It's been said that we're only 3 days away from societal meltdown. And it does, if we can almost lose a society of the great state of Georgia through 3 inches of snow, imagine what could happen with a long-term power outage where the number of important societal needs in which we rely are totally and unexpectedly cut off with no help from anywhere. Our friends in FEMA do a fantastic job in preparation. There's no greater preparatory group than the United States military. We plan everything, and it's done very well. But ladies and gentlemen, I will tell you, we have no plans whatsoever on a tactical level, and I would surmise on a strategic level, that would prepare us to respond to a catastrophic event where infrastructure, particularly the power grid, is taken down. And once the genie is out of the bottle, there is no way we can turn around and remake our preparations for this. We'll be responding with a force that is hollow, one that will not be able to deliver the resources we need to restore society what it was prior to the event, and that's going to incur a long-term effect that will be detrimental to the health and well-being of the United States. Now, although the United States military has prepared itself in some areas, and I think Michael talked about that just a moment ago, I will tell you that the National Guards of the 54 states, territories, and Commonwealths are not prepared to respond to a catastrophic event like this. And I would say that from what I've learned, our friends at the United States Northern Command have a very limited eye on the requirements that will be laid upon them should they be forced to respond to an event such as an EMP attack that takes down the grid. And this is important because without prior planning and looking at options and alternatives that would allow us to respond effectively, I think the military and in turn FEMA and our first responders will be casualties of the event along with our civilian counterparts just as much as we will be responders. So Frank, thank you for letting me share that with you there, and I yield the floor back to you, sir.
Bob, thank you so much, both for being here and for your comments and for your leadership, past and continuing. Let me just summarize what I think we've tried to present to you today, and then we'll open it up to questions, both from you all here and hopefully by phone. Metcalf was a wake-up call. It could have been vastly worse. It was, I think, providential that it wasn't. It is clear that we are facing threats like that. Both of the men cause variety, and they come in a number of different forms and of a naturally occurring kind. The consequences of any of them eventuating would be catastrophic. Peter used the term the CIA offered black swan. existential threat to the United States. We know what it takes to protect the key assets of the grid, and they are basically the power generation facilities, the control centers, the various appurtenances of the grid that moves the power from point A to point B, most especially these large or extremely high voltage transformers that I think are as kind of the irreplaceable backbone of the grid. I say irreplaceable in the sense that in a practical sense it would take years to get any number of them back online. If, say, we just lost the 17 that were shot up at Metcalf, or the 21 that might have been destroyed in toto had they blown up. Those four generic categories of elements of the grid, excuse me, the fourth is the network, the dedicated telecommunications network that the power utility operators rely upon to make sure they've got reliable communications with these various assets. These all need to be protected. There are basically three ways of doing that, broadly defined, that the military has experimented with, developed, tested, proven over decades. Sort of surge protectors, Michael referred to shunts or capacitors, and Faraday cages, shields, physical shields to these assets. We've talked about legislation. There is another piece that was not mentioned, the GRID Act, that actually was approved, I believe 3 years ago now, unanimously in the House of Representatives, only to die in the United States Senate. That has been reintroduced. I think Peter mentioned that has, in fact, now been reintroduced. It would help in ensuring the kind of regulatory arrangements and oversight that is clearly needed to get the grid protected. Finally, we need the utilities of America and organizations like the North American Electric Reliability Corporation to be part of the solution, not to be part of the problem. I fear at the moment they are pretty much in the latter category. I've actually gone so far as to say NERC should actually be used as the acronym for No Electric Resiliency Cabal, because as a practical matter, as we saw in that hearing with the Senate last week, that seems to be the role that they're playing at the moment. It shouldn't be, it certainly needn't be, and I think that the opportunity is now present, given what we've learned, given what these studies document, and by the way, copies of this are available for you outside. Given the expertise of these gentlemen and many others on our Secure the Grid coalition and elsewhere in this country, we know the problem. We have a good handle on what it will take to fix it. We simply need the resolve and the help of those with the greatest vested interest of all to become part of the corrective action that is now required. With that, we will take questions. If you would like to pose one, please identify yourself. If you have somebody you'd like to direct it to, do so. We'll also try to take some calls from the phone, and I've got several that have been previously submitted that we'll get to as well. Let's start with you, sir. I don't know that there's a mic, so just speak up.
Yes, sir.
Please identify yourself.
I'm Preston Old, Tradition Founding Property. So we've got some bureaucrats in industry who don't want to fix this. Why? What is their rationale? I don't get it. It's something as dangerous as this, it should have been fixed a long time ago. Why not a presidential executive order, for heaven's sakes? I mean, $500 million? This is a drop in the bucket. To me, it's a drop in the bucket. What am I missing?
Good question. Peter?
Let me take that. Dr. Graham, in 2008, when he testified and delivered the EMP Commission reports to Congress, was asked that same question. And he said, it's at times like these that I wish instead of having a PhD in electrical engineering, my doctorate was in abnormal psychology. Because it is hard to read the mind. But I think I do have some clues about it. Historically, when it comes to preparing against unlikely catastrophic events, let me back up by saying I'm a big believer in the private sector. I don't think there's any more efficient way than using than the invisible hand of Adam Smith for organizing an economy that will deliver goods and services at the most efficient and lowest cost. But it does have a deficiency, and that is when it comes to things like black swan events, you know, the rare catastrophic event. Whenever a private section decision maker looks at that and says, well, should I spend that extra money, which I'm going to have to pass on to my customer? Economic efficiency tends to dictate, well, no, I'm not. I'm going to keep that cost low. And it's not just the electric power industry, but historically we've seen this in many, and virtually all industries. Look at the Zeppelin industry. You know, why did they fly balloons filled with the explosive gas hydrogen instead of spending a little more money on helium? Had they chosen for that helium to avoid the black swan of the Hindenburg, the Zeppelins might still be us today, okay? Padded dashboards and safety balloons in cars, you know, to prevent them. I mean, these things had to be sort of imposed on a resisting industry. So that's that is one possible explanation. You know, that that these things are regarded by the industry when they look at the calculus of is it worth the cost, that they don't want to go there. Look, arguments that the industry itself has made. NERC, for example, Jerry Cawley, the CEO of NERC, has said they're not responsible for protecting the civilian grid from a nuclear EMP attack. That's the job of the Department of Defense. That's what we have a DOD for. Now, of course, DOD doesn't have any jurisdiction over the electric power grid, and the only way it can protect it is by preventive wars, and I think Americans have had enough of those, or missile defenses, which are highly unreliable and wouldn't work at all against a geomagnetic, you know, superstorm. I think the main point of the opposition is that the electric power grid, the electric industry, is the last of the critical infrastructures. That it's the only critical infrastructure that basically is still exists in a 19th century regulatory environment. Every other critical infrastructure, airline industry, for example, has got something like a Federal Aviation Administration looking over its shoulder. You know, the FAA has the regulatory authority to say it has agents to go around and inspect aircraft. If there's metal fatigue in the wings, you can't fly that. You know, when an airplane crashes, the industry doesn't get to investigate the crash. The FAA drags the broken parts into a hangar and they decide what went wrong so that it won't happen again. We do this because there are hundreds of lives at stake when airplanes fly, and we can't afford to have these kinds of disasters happening. But there is no equivalent, there's no bureaucratic equivalent in the U.S. government to the Federal Aviation Administration for the electric power industry. The President can't issue an executive order to say, you're going to protect that grid, because he doesn't have the legal authority to do it. Congress doesn't have the legal authority to do it. The Department of Homeland Security doesn't. They've been operating at the edge of their legal authorities by asking for example, NERC to come up with plans, for example. That's all they can do. They can ask them to come up with a plan, but they can't force them to implement the plan. That's what the SHIELD Act and the GRID Act are essentially about. Those acts are very similar, and what they will do is, for the first time, give the regulatory authority to the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, so it will have a relationship with the electric power industry similar to what the Federal Aviation Administration has with the airline industry. So she'll say, you're not going to put millions of American lives at risk by neglecting grid security. You are going to take these steps. You know, we'll allow you to do it in terms of, and decide what the most cost-effective way to do it is, but it shall be done. You will harden those transformers, you will protect those SCADA systems, you will protect the American people. That's what it's about, and that's what the resistance is about too. They don't want to allow the federal government to have this regulatory power. And let me just add one more point. General Newman with us today, too modest, you know, this man has among the first to achieve a breakthrough, because it doesn't all have to be done from the federal level. General Newman worked with people in the state of Virginia. So Virginia has passed an EMP protection initiative, one of the first states to do so. Another state is Maine, another state is Florida. The states are tired of waiting for Washington to act. We've been trying for half a decade to make progress and haven't done it. But in a matter of months, we just started the process last year of going to the states to try to get state initiatives passed. Because unlike at the federal level, in most states, the Public Utilities Commissions do have the legal authority to require these guys to protect the grid. And so we're finally achieving a breakthrough and making headway there. Sort of restores your faith in democracy, that in less than a year, we've actually got 3 states that have launched EMP protection initiatives because they're tired of waiting for Washington.
Let me just read a question that came in from, I think, a member of the press who was not able to be with us today. In addition to this highly publicized attack in San Jose, there have been more than 270 other direct and significant acts of vandalism to power substations over the past years around the country. With only 2,000 or so large transformers supporting the nation's 3 electrical networks, a coordinated attack is certainly a possibility. Should we be doing more than building chain link fences with motion detectors to protect these crucial assets? And should the expense for expanding physical security measures be a private, state, or federal responsibility? Any of you wish to take that on? Michael?
Well, I was looking at this with parts of the DOD, as a matter of fact, and the leadership that you would expect to be happening right now is not happening in the federal government. Immediately, they should take this with the seriousness that it is, and they should prioritize the most key nodes, the several hundred key nodes that need to be protected, and they need to ensure that they have established best practices which exist. So there's national laboratories that understand the compliance issue of what you need to do to have a secure system, opaque fences, cameras, motion detectors, etc. And then they have to verify with red teaming. And so these are very established best practices. They use them at key critical facilities, nuclear storage sites, etc. And the knowledge is there. It's not being disseminated. For instance, electric utility that is very much trying to be responsible is CenterPoint Energy in Houston, Texas, one of Texas's largest suppliers. They just built a few years ago a backup command center, and they took the trouble to spend $7 million extra to harden it against the effects of a nuclear EMP. However, they have other challenges, technical challenges, that they would love to have the solutions that the U.S. government developed over the last 50 years. For instance, how to harden intermediary control systems and the like, that there's analogous systems in strategic command and control systems, and they can't get that information out. So there's no good reason for this other than really a lack of leadership of people addressing the problem. Because if any one of us or our colleagues at the EMP Commission and others were to sit down, we could actually make a priority list and say, this is what you're going to do, this is your marching orders, and by the way, the probability merits it. So, and a quick clarity, you had mentioned $500 million. I said that was just for a geomagnetic disturbance, the cost to protect those items. And I only tossed that out there because we did a study of some top scientists at the National Academy of Studies. They know it's not an improbable event. It's inevitably going to occur, and it's inexcusable not to go do something.
Yes, ma'am.
Valerie Greenfield, Americans for Peace and Tolerance. I was curious if Congress, by chance, passed this, how long would it take to actually protect the grid? And if they don't, if states one by one decide to do this, how will that affect the national scheme of it?
The Congressional EMP Commission, in which I served, estimated that that we could protect the grid moving at a leisurely pace, in about 3.5 years. On an emergency basis, within a year, though, you could make very significant steps that would. I mean, the most desirable thing is to do it from a national level. If that were happening, but so far it hasn't been happening, and it's better to do it a state at a time than not at all. Most states are part of a regional grid, but what you can do is you can island a state grid by protecting the key assets. It doesn't affect the way the grid operates on a normal day-to-day basis. It just puts in place those protections so that the grid within that state will survive in the event of an EMP or a cyber or some other catastrophic threat to that grid. And it benefits the other states in the regional grid because there's nothing harder than a black start, that is bringing up a grid or a part of the grid that's in total blackout. In fact, that hasn't even been exercised on a national level, never been exercised, and we don't even know if we could do it. But if you had the states on, the lights on in Virginia or the state of Maine, for example, the neighboring states would benefit from that, because then it would make it easier to recover those neighboring states. So it's a good it's all to the good in terms of the national interest. And ultimately, if we could get a few of the states like California, New York, and Pennsylvania, there are so many HV transformers, and they are so important to the western grid and the eastern grid, that would tremendously increase the overall national security with just a few key states, in particular those, New York, Pennsylvania, California.
Peter, thank you. Emily, do we have anybody calling in? If there's anybody on the phone who would like to ask a question, if you can make sure that they're close to the mic too, that would be great, Michael.
Password.
Yeah. Anybody on the phone? Hello?
Yes, we are.
We open up the questions.
Hold it up to the mic, please, Jake.
I've got one. This is Steve Lasky. I'm the editorial director for Sigma Security Media, and we do a magazine called Security Technology Executive. I've got a question. The draft NERC physical security standard targets all transmission level substations that could be categorized as medium impact and above. While that argument can be made that it justifies based on the threat, what level of energy price increase can the public or the economy withstand to pursue this level of protection?
Well, I didn't hear all of the question, and it was in relation to physical security. But where EMP is concerned, the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission estimated that providing robust protection against the spectrum of EMP threats could be accomplished with an increase to the annual rate to the average ratepayer of about 20 cents annually. So it's a trivial cost.
And to put that in perspective, we think that the key factors of the critical infrastructure, telecommunications, transportation, and sanitation, et cetera, including electric, could be hardened to both natural and man-made EMP in the range of the tens of billions of dollars. And you ask, how does the public react to this? Well, we're a $16 trillion economy, and a few years ago, they didn't react too badly when someone spent $865 billion on a stimulus package that put tunnels under highways for turtles and wrought iron fences on Boston zoos, yet for 5% of that could have hardened against a nuclear EMP, and another 5% of that total expenditure could have given us a robust national missile defense system. And we have neither now, and we have turtles with tunnels under highways for $865 billion.
Yes, sir.
Let me add a couple other data points to that.
Let me get another question, and we'll come back to you, Peter. Go ahead, sir.
I'd like to ask...
Identify yourself, please.
Yeah.
Two questions.
Sir, could you identify yourself, please?
Peter Bear, Energy Wire. Based on your insights, do you think that analysis that was reported on FERC's part, that as few as 9 substations, if they were attacked and taken down, could cause a cascading outage? Does that sound directionally right, your understanding?
Well, I won't comment on that because as I understand it, that was a classified document.
I'm not asking you about the study.
Okay.
Based on your understanding.
Well, my understanding, for instance, there's a Lloyd's of London study of a year ago that said as few as 16 key transformers on the Atlantic coast from a geomagnetic storm could lose power for up to 40 million people for up to 2 years. And you can Google, that's available online, Lloyd's of London. And the nodal dependencies are such that it doesn't take much. The majority of a system doesn't have to be damaged, just key components. And there are, in fact, key components. And part of the concern of the utilities is that they want to keep these secret for good reason, because they're not fixing them, and the fewer people that know about them, the better. But we don't have, for instance, Shlomo Wald. Anyone know who he is? He's the guy in Israel whose job is to keep the grid on. Chris Train, you know who he is? He's the guy in Great Britain whose job is to keep the national grid on. You know who we have? We have Waldo. I have no idea where he is.
Peter, did you want to say anything about that, the critical nodes?
Yeah. Um, Part of what the EMP Commission did is we took a look at blackouts that had been caused by natural disasters. And if you look at those kinds of precedents, the kinds of stresses that many natural disasters have put on the grid are not nearly as severe as these an orchestrated kinetic attack could be. For example, the Great Northeast blackout of 2003 was caused by a falling tree branch that hit high-powered lines, and then that combined with a series of human failures resulted in blacking out 50 million people. You know, there have been numerous cases of multi-state blackouts being caused by what appear to be rather trivial effects, you know, because the fact of the matter is the grid is aged, it's overstressed, it seems to be constantly operating on the verge of collapse. So the idea, to answer the question that Peter Baird put forward, that if you were to take out 9 critical transformer substations, yeah, that sounds entirely plausible that it could cause the collapse of the national electric grid, given what Mother Nature does with falling tree branches and the like that aren't nearly as catastrophic in terms of the origin of the blackouts.
General Newman, did you have anything to add?
I can tell you that from my experience that it's a very fragile grid that's that we see constantly, and I look at natural disasters in Virginia. So it doesn't have to be anything as catastrophic as an EMP, but I can tell you from snowstorms and hurricanes and floods, things that happen and recur regularly, we see the grid tested and we see its repeated failure. Now, it's not going to be for years, but it does talk to the fragility of the grid, and I think it's an omen of how this could catapult into a much more disastrous event should we have something more severe, as Dr. Pry indicated.
Right. Could we see if anybody else is on the phone who would have a question?
Hello, is there any more questions on the call-in line?
Can I be greedy and ask another one?
Sure. Unless somebody else had a question, we'll get back to you. Anybody else on the call? If not, go ahead, sir.
The Metcalf incident was, again, this is Steve Lasky. The Metcalf incident was notable for 2 reasons. First, the intensity and the execution of the attack, and second, the resiliency of the grid and that the resultant outage was limited. What standard of protection should be applied to the grid in light of its redundant and resilient design?
Well, you know, the Metcalf, they lucked out. The first actions was to cut 2 separate fiber optic trunks, and there was still communication so that the control center was able to actually see anomalies that let them be able to shunt power around. So when they shut up those transformers, it wasn't so much that they were going to physically damage the transformer. What they did is they shot up the cooling oils that cool the transformers, and they were if they weren't had the power diverted, they would eventually overheated and been permanently damaged, and it could take up to 18 months to replace them. There was over 50,000 gallons of cooling oil spilt in that attack, a not insignificant amount. And secondly, the FBI recreated this incident about 6 weeks ago, and one well-trained person in the sequence of events could have actually even carried it out. It is not, in my dealings with people at Special Operations Command, it is but a few handful of people necessary to really wreak havoc on these systems. And if they succeeded even in cutting out the telemetry that was going to the control center or the security center, they would have been completely blind as to what was going on. No one would have responded, and those transformers would have all exploded.
I have another question here that maybe you can...
Yes, sir.
I'd like to respond to that too, if I could.
Go ahead.
The conclusion, Peter Pry, you know, the conclusion that NERC has put out there, because the idea that this proves grid resiliency, you know, that's the argument NERC has put out, that Metcalf actually proves grid resiliency. If John Wellinghoff, the former chairman of the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who drew national attention to the Metcalf incident because he was so alarmed about its implications, if he is right, and this was a dry run, that this was training for a much larger attack at some point in the future, that's exactly the conclusion that the bad guys will want us to draw. that this proves our resiliency, that we managed this and so we're ready for anything. I think that's exactly the wrong conclusion to draw from this. You know, the bad guys next time will probably use rocket-propelled grenade launchers or something that would guarantee the destruction of the Transformers. In Wellinghoff's view, this was not a failed attack. This was a dry run. And in a dry run, you don't go all the way because you don't want to so alarm your potential victim that he will down the road take the steps that are necessary to protect the grid. You know, it does seem industry is drawing all the wrong conclusions from this. I don't think they deserve to be credited with resiliency. It also took a month to repair the damage. You know, a damage that was inflicted in a matter of minutes by these unknown assailants who are still unidentified.
One thing, and General, maybe you might speak to this. There was some back and forth early on as to whether, in fact, as you've just said, Peter, this was a very professional and properly, from a sort of special operations point of view, even a properly executed attack, or whether this is just another of these sort of episodes where some bozo goes shooting up a substation. Would you comment on that, Bob? Any thoughts on it, or anybody else?
I have just a couple thoughts, Frank, and it speaks to what I always hope is that someone at a higher level of security clearance that I have is making the right decisions. But every time I feel that way, I've been sorely disappointed. You recall that early on this was not even broadcast, and it was kept within the confines of law enforcement and the regulators as a vandalism attack. Now, whether this was a ploy to protect our vulnerability and to actually not disclose how truly catastrophic this could have been, I don't know. But what we've come to understand from the discussions that Michael and Dr. Pry have had today and from the speaker and the congressman is that everyone knows that we have a vulnerability here. And among those everyones are not only the citizens as well as FERC and NERC and our representatives, but they're the guys that mean to do us harm. So I think we can take this as a wake-up call, regardless of whether we analyze the attacks properly and whether we have the real knowledge and understanding and motive of these guys. It's irrelevant. It shows that they did it. It was potentially disastrous. And what are we doing now? And as we spoke earlier about, not a great deal. We continue to see pushback with a lot of regulatory groups saying, we got it, you guys sleep well, nothing's going to happen. And we're not going to have a second swing at a pitch when this comes through. There's a high fastball. So we've got to get it right. And I think this incident is simply another building block in what we need to do to ensure that the grid is resilient, whether it's from a physical attack or from any type of other attack that could bring us down.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Dino Christmas, Record Response Media. Let me ask you a question. Has anybody done an analysis on the amount of jobs this would create in terms of hardening the grid?
Well, you know, part of the problem is that the numbers we're talking about, you know, several tens of billions of dollars over several years, that's not a tremendous market. So it would have great economic stimulus effect for the dollars spent, but because of it, it's like the same with the missile defense system. There's, you know, for $4 billion we could have a stopgap national missile defense using the Aegis systems. That in the scope of a hundreds of billions of dollar defense budget, that's a line item. So. It would have good. Any dollar spent like this would give you not only jobs, but it's going to give you prosperity for a generation or more because of the resiliency you introduce. To have this Damocles sword hanging over our head is no way to live, and in fact, it adds to the.
I'm just looking at it from like the way that they're selling Keystone. They look at it like a jobs creator. You know, just again, selling the idea of hardening the grid to the public.
Well, let me
can I mention one other thing in this regard? Maybe you can respond to it, Peter. In discussing this with people, particularly at the state level, one issue that has come up again and again is people observing that if you in fact have a state that, as several of our speakers have mentioned, has taken the step to protect their grid, well, you may be able to attract business to your state because you have resilient power, whereas the state you currently are operating in, or neighbor or whatever, doesn't. So whether it's the direct effects or it's the knockoff effects, there is almost certainly going to be some economic play to all of this, I think. Peter, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, just building on what you've said, Frank, that if you look at it, providing protection of the grid, providing energy security, I mean, this is the defense industry of the future. People are concerned about cyber effects, on their businesses and the like. And if you've got an infrastructure that's invulnerable to that, or immune to that, or can at least mitigate that, that makes your state, your region, much more economically competitive. And it seems to me there could be enormous financial benefits to a state that from that. Moreover, we're not the only ones interested in grid protection. Taiwan, South Korea, I think as the threat from EMP attack becomes more widely known, and as our international security environment becomes less and less stable, there's going to be more and more interest among nations around the world. I know that a lot of member states, the United Kingdom is interested in hardening their grid. Israel is interested in hardening theirs. Japan surely will be, now that North Korea, has got the bomb and got these super EMP weapon capabilities. We exported the electric grid to the world, that technology, and it was a tremendous business for us. Let us also become the nation that exports the solution to these threats against the grid.
Amen. Any other questions? Yes, sir, in the back.
Ryan Nichols, Heritage Foundation. Piggybacking off of that, other than some key military installations, is there an example in the commercial sector where the grid has been hardened in the way you'd like that you could point to anywhere in the world?
Russia and China.
Possibly North Korea, too. They don't have a whole lot of electricity system, but I bet what they have is relatively hard. Yes, sir.
Michael Hayne, Alliance for Vigilance. I recall hearing that Lloyd's of London was considering some underwriting standards requiring certain businesses to harden their business. It would seem to me that if the state met those requirements and its neighboring state didn't, that would create quite an economic opportunity. Where do we stand? What's the latest with those underwriting standards?
I agree with you, and my understanding is that Lloyd's is pressing forward with them. They've got underwriting standards now for cybersecurity, and I understand from a recent press report I read that about half the businesses they've been interviewing, aren't able to meet their standards. I know there was earlier this year, there was a conference in London sponsored by Lloyd's to look at the threat to electric grids from geomagnetic storms. So they are pressing forward. I don't know that they've actually written standards yet, but it does seem to be in the works, and they're going to do that. And the requirement for utilities to meet GMD EMP standards, would be a significant step in the right direction. Who knows, might even be more compelling than the legislation we're trying to pass in the end of the day. Yeah. And it could be a way where the invisible hand of Adam Smith does take care of this problem.
Just one point on that. I'm struck by the fact that if somehow miraculously one could perfectly harden the grid, its computers, SCADA systems, and so on against cyber attack, but you've failed to protect it against EMP or these other sorts of attacks, those computers are not going to operate without power. So this is part of why we're taking an all hazards approach and believe that it's absolutely imperative that we not sort of silo these threats and ignore some of the other ones. Yes, sir.
I'm Damien Privataro. I'm at the Georgetown Law School. I was wondering if any of you could comment on NERC's grid security exercise, or both of them that they completed in 2012, first of all, and then again in 2013. And notably, if you could point out any deficiencies you see in those security exercises.
Yeah, I actually just asked a NERC representative of that at a private DHS FBI briefing that we're allowed to attribute without putting name. And I asked them, I said, look, the 2003 Northeast blackout that put power out for a day and a half for 50 million people, it had an economic impact of $6 billion, and they attributed 11 lives lost because of it. So I said, just using those simple metrics of economic impact and lives lost, what was the economic impact and lives lost of your Grid X2? And he goes, well, we really didn't look into that. And of course we had lives lost because some of the exercise had, I guess, people shooting, active shooters shooting up stations. He said, so they also, those guns were also turned on people. And you know what? I don't need an electric grid study to tell me that if an active shooter shoots someone, they go to a casualty list. I do need to know how they measure the impact, because what was the National Geographic special had just a couple of weeks of an outage, and there was tens of thousands.
10 days.
10 days, and how many tens of thousands was it? To 20, 30,000 an estimate. You're talking when people in France, when they had heat waves a few summers ago, and they don't have a lot of attention to elderly. You had a lot of the elderly dying just because they didn't have air conditioning. Okay, so there's if GridX was an honest exercise, you would have seen a massive economic impact and a massive loss of life. That if you published that, and I don't know that they have any plan on publishing the details of it either. You can get it if you're a member organization. And I know for a fact that they selectively excluded people that were not members of NERC from even participating, even though they should have had a right to. So I don't give any credence that was of any use whatsoever to policymakers or the American public or even the utilities to understand what they need to do to secure their grids better.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're going to wrap up. I just want to make a couple of closing comments. One is, as we've talked about this event a year ago today, I don't think anybody's mentioned that we don't know who did it or why they did it, because they got away. What you've heard today about the possibilities of more attacks taking down not just localized parts of the grid, but perhaps the entire grid, has to be thought of in the context of at least those perpetrators and perhaps others being at large right now. So again, this is no drill. This is a real world problem. It is a problem that we all have a stake in, every single one of us. Whether you're Republican or Democrat or independent, you're old, you're young, you're black, you're Hispanic, you're white, everyone. If, as I think Peter Pry mentioned, Dr. William Graham, who authored or chaired the commission that authored the first two of these studies, pointed out 9 out of 10 of us are not going to make it if the power goes off and stays off for a year. And it won't be on the basis of party affiliation or political philosophy that you die. So I mention that not to make light of it, but to the contrary, to make the point that we all need to put our shoulders to the wheel of getting the grid fixed. And finally, I must tell you, having worked with this wonderful group of people in the coalition for the past 9 or 10 months now, what I'm struck by, and I think it's evident in what you've been told today, but at the risk of overstating the point, let me just put it plainly. Enemies of this country know about these vulnerabilities. The government of the United States knows about these vulnerabilities. The electric utilities know about these vulnerabilities. The only people, if I may use the expression, who are being kept in the dark about our vulnerabilities are the American people. Metcalf has injected a little bit of light on that, but believe me, there is a concerted effort being made. Witness that hearing last week to get the lights back off, even though the title was Keeping the Lights On. Our concern is the American people will be kept in the dark permanently if we don't take the sorts of steps we know how to take, we can afford to take, and we simply cannot afford not to take. We need your help, and that of hopefully all those who are watching this videotape and who will otherwise be moved by this sort of information to become part of the solution. If you would like more information about it, please visit our site, which is securethegrid.com. All of the members of our coalition are involved in this, and many of them have their own websites. You can find out more about that at the website as well. Please get involved in this fight. It is for all of our futures and that of our children and grandchildren. With that, I want to ask you to join me in thanking this terrific panel and those who appeared by video. And thank you for coming.